When my grown grandson called me Grandpa for the first time in 6 months, I thought I was getting my family back. Then I heard him reading the sentence she had placed in front of him. I am Malcolm Whitaker. I am 58 years old. I live at 17 Willowmere Crescent in the south end of Halifax, Nova Scotia, in a house I bought with my wife Margaret in the spring of 2004. It is a narrow 3-story Victorian with pale gray siding and a front porch that lists very slightly to the left, something I always meant to fix and never did because Margaret said she liked the way it gave the house character. She said a perfectly level porch was the porch of a man who had never lived hard enough to settle. On the evening this story truly began, I was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea I had forgotten to drink. The rain was doing what Halifax rain does in November, which is not dramatic but relentless. A fine gray mist that finds its way into everything. The old black telephone on the counter, the kind with a cord that I have refused to replace for reasons I cannot fully explain even to myself, had just stopped ringing. I was looking at it the way a man looks at something that has already hurt him once, and he knows is about to hurt him again. In my other hand, I was holding a photograph of Margaret. It was not a special photograph in the professional sense. It was one I had taken myself in the backyard in the summer of 2016, 3 years before she died. She was sitting on the small wooden bench she had found at a church sale in Dartmouth and painted herself, and she was laughing at something I had said that I no longer remember. The light was the particular gold of a Halifax August afternoon, and it had caught her hair in a way that made her look younger than her years. I set the photograph down when the phone rang again. I picked it up. Grandpa. A pause. It's Ethan. Ethan is 26 years old. He is my son Adrian's son, which makes him my grandson, and he is also a man who graduated 2 years ago from Dalhousie with a degree in environmental science and who has his mother's precise way of speaking and his father's particular difficulty with silences. He calls me Grandpa even now because that was what he called me from the time he could speak, and neither of us has ever found a reason to change it. I had not heard his voice in 6 months. Ethan, I said, I am glad to hear from you. Another pause. Longer this time, the kind of pause that carries weight. Grandpa, I need to read you something. His voice was low and adult and constrained in a way that told me everything before a single word of it was said. I could hear the discomfort in the controlled steadiness of it, the way a person sounds when they are trying to get through a sentence they have not chosen. He read it carefully. Lauren, his mother, my daughter-in-law, had asked him to convey a condition. If Malcolm wished to be welcomed back to family dinners, to the Sunday afternoons at their place on Fern Lane, to the ordinary rhythms of being a grandfather and a father again, he would need to sign the transfer of 17 Willowmere Crescent into her name. This would be done, she had said, as a gesture of trust before her wedding anniversary with Adrian, as a way of showing the family that he was committed to their future together. I stood at that counter with the telephone cord looped once around my left hand the way I always hold it without thinking, and I let the words settle into the quiet kitchen. The rain was still doing its patient work against the window glass. The tea was cold. Margaret's photograph was face up on the counter beside the stove. I did not explode. I did not accuse. I did not threaten or argue or raise my voice. I said, I love you, Ethan. I will not make you carry her message. Then I placed the telephone back in its cradle. Not in anger, in something closer to grief. Because what I was ending in that moment was not just a phone call. I was ending the arrangement in which my 26-year-old grandson was being used as the bridge of a negotiation that had no business passing through him at all. I want you to stop here with me for just one moment before I keep going. I have been carrying this story for a long time, and I have never said any of it out loud in quite this way to another living person. So let me ask you something. Where are you right now? What city are you in? What province or state? Drop it in the comments because I genuinely want to know who is out there in the dark, listening to an old man talk about a phone call he cannot forget. And what time is it where you are? If it is late, if the house is quiet, and you cannot explain why you found this tonight, I understand that feeling completely. Leave a like if this story is landing somewhere real for you. Subscribe because there is something new here every day. And let me go back to the beginning of this, which starts 3 years before that phone call, on a gray March afternoon when I opened my front door and made a decision that changed everything. 3 years before that telephone call, I opened the door of this house to my son Adrian and his wife Lauren, and I told them they could stay as long as they needed. I want to be precise about who Adrian is, because precision matters to this story. He is 34 years old. He works in project coordination at a marine logistics company with offices near the waterfront on Lower Water Street, and he is good at his work in the particular way of a man who understands systems and is less comfortable with people. He has my height and Margaret's brown eyes and a way of going quiet in difficult conversations that I spent 30 years trying to understand and eventually concluded was simply his nature. He does not avoid conflict because he is cowardly in the ordinary sense. He avoids conflict the way certain buildings avoid the wind, by being built in a shape that lets trouble pass around them rather than through them. The financial difficulty that brought them to my door was real and was not caused by anything dramatic. Adrian had made a series of investment decisions during the period when everyone around him was talking about certain opportunities with an enthusiasm that felt like knowledge. And when those decisions unwound, the losses were significant. Not catastrophic in the sense of legal trouble or genuine ruin, but serious enough that the lease on their apartment on Quinpool Road was not something they could sustain, and the savings that should have been there were not. He told me this on the phone in February, and I could hear in the specific flatness of his voice the weight of telling his father something he felt should not need to be said. I said, "Come here. The house is too large for one person. Come here." What I did not know in that February, and what I want you to understand took a long time to become clear to me, is that Lauren and my son did not arrive at 17 Willowmere Crescent the same way. Adrian arrived with relief and quiet shame, the kind a man carries when he has needed help he did not expect to need. Lauren arrived with something else, something I could not have named then and took me almost 2 years to understand clearly. Lauren Whitaker is 32 years old. She works as an administrative coordinator at a private health clinic on Spring Garden Road, which is perhaps 15 minutes from the house on foot on a good day. She is organized in the way that very particular people are organized, in a way that goes beyond preference and into something more structural, as if the ordering of her environment is not comfort, but necessity. When she arrived with Adrian that March afternoon, she had already made a list of what they would need and where things would go and how the shared spaces would function. She handed me a folded piece of paper in the front hall with things like kitchen cleaning rotation and bathroom schedule written in very neat handwriting, and I took it and said that seemed sensible and put it on the fridge. I told myself this was efficiency. I told myself it was the natural instinct of a careful woman coming into someone else's home and trying to be respectful. I told myself a lot of things in those first months that were not entirely wrong but were not entirely complete either. Margaret had been gone for 2.5 years by then. She died in October of 2019, which was before the particular strangeness the whole world then went through, and sometimes I think of the timing of her absence and the timing of what came after and wonder if she was protected from something, or if she was simply gone too soon. I do not resolve that question. I sit with it the way I sit with the listing porch, as a thing that simply is. The house without Margaret had its own quality of silence. Not an empty silence, because a house that has been lived in fully for 15 years never truly goes empty. Every room held something of her. The staircase with its particular creak on the 4th step, the bookshelf in the corridor crammed with paperbacks whose spines she had broken because she pressed them completely open when she read, the small wooden bench in the backyard that was visible from the kitchen window and that I had not been able to bring myself to move or paint or change in any way since she put it there. When Adrian and Lauren moved into the upper floor of the house, the quality of silence changed. I told myself, this was good. I told myself a house needed voices in it. The first changes were small enough that I noted them without concern. Lauren rearranged the furniture in the front sitting room while I was out one morning, explaining when I returned, that the traffic flow was better with the sofa against the east wall. She was right about the traffic flow. I did not say anything about the fact that she had not asked. She began receiving mail at the Willowmere address. This was logical, since she was living there. But among the mail were not only personal correspondence and billing statements, but correspondence from her workplace, from a professional association she belonged to, and from a financial services company I did not recognize. When I asked about that last one, she said it was simply consolidated mailing, that she had streamlined all her accounts to one address, and that she hoped I did not mind. I said I did not mind. She suggested, in April of that first year, that certain pieces of furniture in the second-floor hallway were taking up space that could be more usefully organized. The pieces she mentioned were a narrow console table that had belonged to Margaret's mother, and a small framed mirror that had hung in the same spot since we moved in. I said I preferred to keep them where they were. She said, of course, that was entirely my choice, and she said it with a smile that was warm and reasonable, and that left me with a feeling I could not fully justify or articulate. The feeling of a man who has given the correct answer to a question and still does not feel sure about it. In the summer of that first year, she used the phrase "our future base" for the first time. She was on the telephone in the kitchen with someone I did not know, discussing a gathering she was planning, and I heard it from the hallway. Our future base. I stood in the hallway for a moment and then continued into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and did not say anything, because I did not know how to say anything about a phrase in a telephone conversation in a way that would not make me seem unreasonable. I am a man who spent 30 years in marine insurance administration. I understand documents. I understand the difference between what a contract says and what a conversation implies. I understand that certain language is imprecise and that reading too much into informal conversation is its own kind of error. I told myself this. I told myself this several more times over the following months. In September of that year, Lauren sat down with me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what she called a practical conversation. She said that she and Adrian had been thinking about the future, about stability, about what it meant to genuinely commit to being here, rather than treating this as a temporary arrangement. She said she wanted Malcolm. She called me Malcolm in these conversations rather than Dad or anything else, to feel that they were invested. She said that one way a family expressed investment was through shared ownership, that it was something worth considering, that it was simply a matter of making what was emotionally true also legally clear. I said I would think about it. She nodded as if this were a reasonable beginning of a process that was already underway. I want to be honest with you about something. I am not a man who requires much validation. I spent the better part of my adult life solving problems quietly and going home and making dinner, and not needing to be particularly praised for any of it. Margaret used to say I was the most self-sufficient person she had ever loved, and she did not always mean it entirely as a compliment. What she was naming was a quality that served me in many situations, and that in this one worked against me, because the loneliness of the house, and the loneliness of widowhood, and the particular tenderness of having my son back under this roof made me slower to see what I was looking at than I might otherwise have been. I wanted them here. That is the honest fact. I wanted the voices in the house. I wanted the Sunday dinners with Ethan coming over from his apartment on Robbie Street, and the ordinary domestic sounds of other people living nearby. I wanted it badly enough that I explained away each small displacement as a natural friction of people sharing space, each suggestion as the practical thinking of an organized woman, each conversation about the future as the reasonable planning of a family trying to build something. I was 60 miles inland from my own instincts, and I did not know it yet. The folders came to light in October of the following year, not in any dramatic way. I was reorganizing the small office on the ground floor, the room that had been Margaret's workspace, and that I had largely left unchanged since her death, and I was clearing the closet shelf that held her archive boxes, the kind she used for keeping records because she was a woman who kept records of everything and believed paper was more reliable than digital storage. The boxes were labeled in her handwriting, and I was moving them to make room for a set of tax files I needed accessible, and I found one box that was different from the others. It was pushed to the back of the shelf behind two other boxes, not hidden exactly, but placed with a deliberateness that was distinct from the casual organization of the others. It was labeled in Margaret's hand. The label said simply, "For the house, if I am not here." I sat down on the floor of that closet with the box in my lap for a long time before I opened it. I am going to tell you what was in it. But first I need you to stay with me here, because what comes next is the part of this story that changed everything, and it changed it not the way I expected. Not by giving me something to use against someone, but by giving me something I had lost without knowing I had lost it. The box contained a blue folder. I want you to know exactly what that blue folder looked like, because I have held it in my hands more times since then than I can count, and the physical fact of it matters to me. It was a standard legal-size folder, the kind you find at any office supply shop. In a blue that had faded slightly at the edges from years in the closet, my name was written on the front tab in Margaret's handwriting. Not both our names, just mine. Inside the folder, there was a collection of documents that Margaret had assembled at some point in the last years of her life, organized in chronological order, the way she organized everything. There were copies of the original purchase contract for the house from 2004. There were records of every mortgage payment from the first year to the final one, with the payments documented as made from our joint account, and then, from 2011 onward, from my account alone after Margaret left her position at the university library and was working only part-time while managing the illness that had begun quietly in that year. There was a letter from a lawyer named Thomas Barclay, who had been a family friend and who died in 2020, outlining in clear professional language the nature of the ownership and the intention behind it. And at the bottom of everything, sealed in a smaller envelope that had my name written on the front in the same hand and that had never been opened, there was a letter. I want you to understand that I sat on the floor of that closet for a very long time before I opened the envelope. Her handwriting was unchanged. Margaret was meticulous about her handwriting in the way she was meticulous about everything she cared about, and the letter was written in the same clear, considered script that I had been reading for 31 years. It was dated the 14th of June, 2018, which was 16 months before she died, and approximately 8 months after she received the diagnosis that told her what the next year and a half would look like. She had known she was going to leave. She had sat down in June of 2018 and written me a letter about the house. I will not reproduce her exact words because those words belong to her and to me and to that closed office on a gray October afternoon. But I will tell you what she said in the way that it reached me, sitting on that floor, with the box open beside me and the rain just starting again against the window. She said that she had watched Malcolm love this house the way some people love their faith, not as a refuge from the world, but as the place where the world became comprehensible. She said she had always understood that the house was not really about the walls, or the mortgage, or the assessed value, but about the continuous act of living in it, the fourth step creak, and the garden bench, and the particular light in the kitchen on winter mornings. She said she trusted me to understand that love. And then she said the thing that broke me open and put me back together in the same moment. She said, "I am not writing this because I know who will press you or how. I am writing it because I know you, Malcolm. I know that you will be lonely, and that being lonely will make you generous in ways that cost you more than money. I know that love, for you, has always meant making room. And I am asking you to remember that making room for people is not the same as giving away the room they are standing in. This house should be your dignity, not your currency. Promise me you will hold it." That was the letter. 16 months before she died, she had written me a letter about the specific vulnerability she knew I would face without her. I did not move from that closet floor for a very long time. When I finally stood up, I did not go into the kitchen where Lauren was making dinner. I did not go upstairs where I could hear Adrian watching something on his laptop. I went to the front porch, the one that lists to the left, and I stood in the November dark with the cold Halifax air, and I understood something that I had been working toward understanding for almost 2 years. My wife had known. Not Lauren specifically, not the particular form the pressure would take, but the shape of my loneliness and the exact place where my love for family would become my liability She had known that. She had sat down in June of 2018 and written me a letter so that when the moment came, I would not be standing in it alone. I was not, it turned out, alone. But the path from that closet floor to the morning I walked into the Halifax Law Courts at 1815 Upper Water Street with Fiona Caldwell beside me was not a straight line, and I want to tell you every step of it. Because the steps matter. The hesitations and the partial truths and the moments when I almost convinced myself I was wrong about what I was seeing, all of that matters. Not because it makes me look good, because it is what actually happened, and I promised myself a long time ago that this story would be told the way Margaret would have told it, which is to say honestly, without flattery to anyone including myself. Stay with me. What comes next is where this becomes something more than one man's argument about a house. I need to go back further than the closet. I need to take you back to the months before I found the blue folder, because the picture of what Lauren was doing did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, slowly, detail by detail, and for a long time I was watching something emerge that I could not yet name. The second autumn of Adrian and Lauren's residence at Willowmere Crescent was the season in which the pattern became a pattern. I want you to understand Lauren as a full person. I am going to ask you to hold the complexity of her for a few minutes before the story reaches the part where complexity stops being a defense. She is a woman who is genuinely capable and genuinely organized, and who, in another configuration of events, I think I could have respected more completely than I ended up being able to. She grew up in a household in Truro that I know only from what Adrian has described, which is that her family did not have much, and that she learned very early that the difference between having enough and not having enough was the difference between being prepared and being caught short. That education produced something in her that was simultaneously her most effective quality and her most damaging one, the absolute refusal to be at the mercy of circumstances she could see coming. I understand that refusal. I was not born with money either. I built what I have over 35 years of patient, unglamorous work in an industry that rewards consistency above everything else. I know exactly what it feels like to look at a future that could go wrong and decide it will not go wrong on your watch. What I could not accept was the specific way in which Lauren had decided to manage the future she was afraid of, because the future she was protecting herself against included me. And the tool she had chosen to use was my love for my son and my grandson. The first thing I noticed that I could not explain away was in September of the second year. Lauren came to me one Thursday evening when Adrian was at a work function and Ethan was over for dinner, which happened most Thursday evenings because Ethan liked to come by and eat something that was not whatever he had made in his Rubby Street kitchen, and she sat across from me at the kitchen table with her phone and showed me a message. She said she wanted me to see it. It was a message in a group thread that included her name and the names of two of her friends from the clinic, and in the thread she had written something about Malcolm's house, in a context that implied pending transition. She said she was showing me because she wanted to be transparent about a conversation she had been having about their plans, and she wanted me to understand that she was not taking anything for granted, but that she had been discussing with people she trusted the possibility of formalizing the arrangement because it was, she said, the kind of thing that simply made sense from a planning perspective. I asked her what she meant by formalizing. She said she meant that a formal transfer of the property would give everyone clarity. It would protect the house in the event of any complications. It would mean that if something happened to me, the house would not need to go through a process that could be complicated and painful for everyone. I said something happened to me meant my death. She said she was simply being practical. I said I appreciated practical thinking, and I would give it serious consideration. Ethan was in the next room. He was watching something on the television in the sitting room, and I could hear the low sound of it through the doorway. And I remember being grateful that he was there because his presence in the house was the version of this family that I had not yet lost, and I did not want to say anything in that kitchen that would change the particular ease of Thursday evenings. I gave it serious consideration. I considered it for 3 weeks. And what I concluded at the end of 3 weeks was that the specific form of Lauren's practicality was aimed at something that had nothing to do with protecting me. Because here is what a person who is protecting someone does not do. A person who is protecting someone does not reference conversations they have been having with third parties about a transfer of property before the person whose property it is has agreed to any such transfer. A person who is protecting someone does not use the word formalizing as if the decision has been made, and the remaining question is only timing. A person who is protecting someone does not bring this conversation specifically to the evening when the son of the house is absent. I noted all of these things. I did not say any of them. I began quietly to pay a different kind of attention. What I noticed over the following weeks and months was a series of moments that individually were invisible as evidence, but that together were unmistakable as a campaign. Lauren began speaking to people outside the family about the house in ways that implied arrangements that did not exist. I learned this through Ethan, not because he reported it to me directly, but because he mentioned something in passing one Thursday about his mother having said to a colleague at the clinic that the Willowmere house was being settled into the family name. Ethan said it, the way you repeat something that seems ordinary, and I received it the way you receive something that is not ordinary at all, which is to say, I smiled and said that was interesting and asked him how his work was going and went to bed that night without sleeping. Lauren began forwarding mail. I did not initially realize what was happening because the volume of correspondence to the address had simply increased, and I was not monitoring it carefully. When I did look more closely, I found that certain pieces of mail addressed to me were arriving already opened, and then resealed, badly enough that the tampering was visible if you were looking. I could not prove this was intentional. I noted it. She also, on 2 separate occasions that I am certain of, and probably others I am not, intercepted telephone calls that were intended for me by answering the house line before I could reach it and speaking with the caller in a way that suggested she was the appropriate person to relay information to. One of these callers was Thomas Barclay's widow, who had rung to discuss a small matter related to a document Thomas had prepared for me years before. When I asked Lauren about this call, she said she had simply taken a message and passed it along, that she had not known it was personal, and that she was sorry if she had overstepped. She said it with complete composure. She said it as if overstep was a word that applied to something minor and logistical, rather than to a boundary that had been deliberately crossed. This is where I need to pause and be honest about something that I find difficult to be honest about. I want to take a breath here and check in with you for a moment, whoever is listening to this, because what I am about to tell you in the next section is the part I am least proud of, the part where I have to account for my own hesitation, and I want you to be here for it. So, tell me where you are. What is your city? What province or state? Drop it in the comments. And if this story is the kind that you need to hear at whatever hour you found it, leave me a like. Subscribe if you want to stay for everything that comes next. There is a new story here every day, and I have a great deal left to say. Now let me tell you about the part where I almost convinced myself I was wrong. I am a man who spent my professional life in marine insurance, which is one of those industries that sounds more interesting than it generally is, and that trains you above almost everything else in the assessment of risk and the documentation of reality. I understand contracts. I understand what evidence means in a formal context. I also understand, from 35 years of working with people and their claims and their disputes, that the most dangerous thing a man can do in a complicated situation is to act on his interpretation of events before he has assembled enough actual facts to support that interpretation. I had suspicions. What I did not yet have was proof, and the line between a suspicious man and a paranoid one is a line I was very careful about. What made the line harder to walk was this: I was also lonely. I have said this once, and I will say it again because it is important to the honesty of the story. I was lonely in the particular way of a man who has been one half of a partnership for 31 years, and is now one whole of something he did not choose to be. And the loneliness made me want to believe the best version of what I was seeing. It made me generous with my interpretations in a way that my professional training knew was a mistake, but that my heart kept arguing for. Adrian did not help me see more clearly, though I do not entirely blame him for this. My son is a man who processes difficulty by declining to look at it until it has resolved itself or become unavoidable. This is not a criticism of his character, it is simply a description of how he is built. When I raised my first tentative concern with him, in November of that second year, over coffee at the kitchen table on a morning when Lauren was at the clinic, he listened with the particular expression he has had since he was a boy, which is the expression of a man who is genuinely trying to absorb something and finding it harder than expected. He said he understood why I might feel that way. He said Lauren could be a lot sometimes. He said she meant well. He said the last few years had been hard on everyone, and that he hoped we could all just find a way forward that worked. I asked him what finding a way forward meant, specifically. He said he thought we all needed to be flexible. I asked him if flexible meant that I should consider signing over the house. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he thought it might make things easier. He said he knew it was a big thing to ask, and he was not asking me to do it right away, and he understood completely if I said no, but that Lauren had been under a lot of stress and that having clarity about the future would probably ease things significantly. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment. It was not anger. I know anger when it comes, and this was not it. What I felt was something colder and more specific, the particular sensation of understanding that your son is already inside the logic of the person you are worried about, that the words he is using are not entirely his own, and that reaching him is going to require more than one conversation over coffee. I said I would think about it. He nodded the way a man nods when he is relieved that the conversation is ending. I did not think about whether to transfer the house. I thought about how to understand what was actually happening. This is where the blue folder changed everything, but not in the sequence you might expect. Because I found the folder in October, and I found the letter in October, and I sat on the floor of that closet in October and understood things I had not understood before. But I did not go to a lawyer in October. I did not make a plan in October. What I did in October was grieve. I sat with Margaret's letter for 10 days. I read it again. I read it in the morning with my tea, and I read it in the evening with a glass of the scotch I keep in the cabinet beside the stove, and I sat with the specific weight of it, which was not the weight of information, but the weight of being known. The thing that her letter did to me was not strategic. It was the particular experience of hearing the voice of the person who understood you best in the world speaking directly to the fear you had not yet admitted you were carrying. I'd been afraid. I want to say that plainly. Not afraid of Lauren in any physical sense. Afraid of the thing she was exploiting, which was my desire not to be the old man who drove his family away. Not to be the grieving widower who turned bitter and suspicious and ended up alone in a large house with no one willing to visit. I had been afraid of that version of myself, and Lauren had sensed it the way certain people sense weakness. Not cruelly, perhaps, not even consciously at first, but the way a structure settles toward the weakest point. The letter from Margaret did not remove the fear. It named it, and naming it changed what it could do to me. On the 23rd of November, I telephoned Fiona Caldwell. I had known Fiona for 11 years. She is 49 years old and has practiced family and property law in Halifax since the late 1990s, with offices on Hollis Street 3 blocks from the harbor. I had met her through a professional connection when she helped a colleague of mine with an estate matter, and we had stayed in loosely cordial contact over the years in the way that people do when they respect each other without having occasion to need each other. She had sent a card when Margaret died. I had sent one when her father died the following year. We were not close friends. We were something more durable than that. Two people with a mutual understanding that went back far enough to mean something. I called her at the office and her assistant put me through and she said, "Fiona Caldwell," which is how she always answers, as if she is presenting evidence of herself. I said, "Fiona, I need to talk to someone about my house. I think I need to understand my options before I make any decisions I cannot take back." She said, "Come in tomorrow morning, 8:30. That was the whole conversation. She did not ask me to explain. She did not tell me it would be all right or ask me to stay calm. or soften anything. She simply told me to come in at 8:30, which was exactly what I needed someone to say. I walked to her office the next morning through the kind of November air that Halifax does better than almost anywhere, cold and salt-edged and entirely honest about what it is. I walked up Hollis Street past the old post office building and past the familiar cluster of legal offices and government buildings that make up the center of this city's civic life, and I walked with the blue folder under my arm, which I had never taken out of the house before, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time. I felt like myself. Fiona's office is the kind that belongs to a person who uses it for actual work rather than for impression management. There are files on the desk and books on the shelves that have been read rather than displayed, and a window that looks out onto the street that she sits with her back to because, she once told me, watching pedestrians while she is trying to think is not conducive to thinking. She shook my hand and poured coffee without asking whether I wanted it, and sat across from me and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." I told her everything from the beginning. It took about 40 minutes. She did not interrupt. She took notes on a yellow legal pad in the quick, abbreviated hand of someone who has spent decades translating complicated situations into precise language. When I finished, she looked at her notes for a moment, and then she looked at me. She said, "How long have you been sitting on this?" I said, "Since October in terms of the folder, since about 18 months ago in terms of the pattern." She said, "And in that time, has anyone external to the family been told that this transfer was agreed to or in process?" I said I was not certain. I knew that Lauren had spoken to people about transition in a way that implied movement toward something. I knew that Ethan had mentioned something a colleague had said. I did not know the full extent of what had been said to whom. Fiona made a note and said, "That is what we need to understand first. Before anything else, we need to know whether a narrative has been established externally that will need to be formally contradicted." She asked me to leave the blue folder with her, with the understanding that she would have copies made and would return the originals. I handed her the folder and she set it on the desk beside her legal pad, and I noticed that she did not open it while I was there, which was a particular kind of professional respect that I appreciated without being able to fully articulate why. As I was standing to leave, she said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, "Malcolm, the most important thing I need you to understand right now is that you have not done anything wrong by wanting your family nearby. That instinct is not a weakness. What you are dealing with is someone who treated your love as a resource to be managed. Those are very different things." I walked back up Hollis Street to the harbor. I stood at the waterfront for a while and watched the gray water and the container ships in the distance, and the particular quality of the November sky over the Dartmouth shore. Then I walked home to Willowmere Crescent and went in through the front door and took my coat off in the hall and put the kettle on. That evening Ethan came for Thursday dinner. He was cheerful and ate a great deal, and talked about a project he was working on related to water quality assessment in Bedford Basin. Lauren was there, and Adrian was there, and the four of us ate at the kitchen table with the rain beginning again outside, and it looked, from the outside, exactly like a family having dinner. I watched it from inside, and understood that what I was looking at had changed. Not the room, not the people in it, my own position within it. I was no longer a man waiting to understand what was happening. I was a man who understood and was now deciding, carefully and without rush, what to do next. The thing I want you to know about the weeks between that dinner and the meeting at Fiona's office, where everything came into the open, is that they were the longest weeks of the process. Not the most dramatic, not the most painful, the longest, because I was living inside a situation I had diagnosed while continuing to behave as if I had not, which requires a particular kind of discipline that I do not think I would have managed without Margaret's letter to anchor me. Lauren did not know what I had found. She did not know about the blue folder, or about Fiona, or about the specific nature of my conversation in that Hollis Street office. She continued operating as if the plan she had been constructing was on its ordinary track, slightly slowed perhaps by my continued non-committal responses to her suggestions about the future, but fundamentally intact. What she did not know was that Fiona had begun making inquiries. Careful ones. The kind that leave no visible trace on the surface, but that pull threads that eventually cause things to unravel. What Fiona found over the following 6 weeks, I will tell you in the next section. But before I do, I need to pause here one more time, because there is something I want to say to you directly, whoever you are, wherever you are watching this from tonight. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the person in a situation who sees clearly when everyone around them either cannot see or will not. It is not the loneliness of isolation. It is the loneliness of being awake in a room full of people who are asleep, where you cannot wake them without disrupting everything, and you cannot sleep yourself because you know what you know. If you have ever been in that room, if you have ever been the person carrying information that no one around you was ready to receive, I want you to know that I understand that particular weight very well. Where are you right now? What city? What part of the world? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know who is out there in this with me. If this story is landing somewhere real, leave a like, subscribe for daily stories, and stay with me, because what Fiona found is where this story stops being about one family's kitchen table and becomes something that had been planned far more carefully than I had understood. What she put on the table in front of me, 3 folded sheets of printed paper in a manila folder, changed the shape of everything I thought I knew. And it did not make me angry exactly. It made me very, very quiet. The first sheet was a message thread that had been forwarded to a third party, someone outside the family entirely, in which Lauren had described the Willowmere property as transitioning to family ownership with Malcolm's support and blessing. She had written these words in the summer of that year, 14 months before the evening Ethan made that phone call with the condition attached. 14 months. She had been telling people it was already decided for 14 months. The second sheet was a message in which she had described a conversation with me as having moved in a positive direction, and in which she had said that Malcolm was on board with the security arrangement, that it was simply a matter of timing and paperwork. I had not said those words. I had not said anything close to those words. I had said, on multiple occasions, that I would think about it. The third sheet was a draft, a document formatted as a property transfer notification. It had the address of the house. It had my name in the line reserved for the current registered owner. It had Lauren's name in the line reserved for the incoming registered owner. My signature line was blank. I sat in Fiona's office looking at the blank line where my signature should have been if any of what Lauren had been telling people were true, and I understood something about myself in that moment with a clarity that I had not had before. My family had been living inside a version of my future that I had never agreed to. They had been planning within it, and speaking within it, and making decisions within it. And the man whose name was on the line, whose house it was, whose consent was the one essential thing, had been treated as a detail to be managed rather than a person to be asked. That, more than anything Lauren had done or said, was what I could not accept. Not the ambition, not the pressure, not even the manipulation of Ethan, as painful as that was. What I could not accept was the casual absence of my own consent from the story of my own life. Fiona asked me what I wanted to do. I told her. She made a note on her legal pad, the same quick abbreviated script, and then she looked up at me and said, "All right, here's how we do this properly." There is a particular quality to the silence of a house when you are the only one in it who knows what is about to change. I lived inside that silence for 3 weeks between my second meeting with Fiona and the morning everything moved. 3 weeks of Thursday dinners and ordinary conversations about the weather and the state of the harbor and whether the kitchen needed a new faucet. 3 weeks of watching Lauren organize the refrigerator and hearing Adrian come up the back stairs at 6:30 every evening and seeing Ethan's truck parked outside on Thursday afternoons. 3 weeks of being the man I had always been in that kitchen while carrying something underneath the surface of myself that no one in the house could see. I want to tell you what those 3 weeks felt like from the inside, because I think they are the most important weeks of the whole story, and they are also the ones that are hardest to explain. The temptation, when you are in possession of information that gives you an advantage, is to use it, to say something, to let some of it show. The other temptation, almost as strong, is to question it. to sit with what Fiona had put on the table and find reasons why it might be less conclusive than it looked, why there might be innocent explanations for the message thread and the forwarded notes, and the draft document with the blank signature line. These two temptations ran in opposite directions, and they ran simultaneously, and navigating between them required a discipline I had not known I possessed until I needed it. What helped me most in those 3 weeks was Margaret's letter. I read it every morning. I did not do this out of sentimentality, though sentiment was certainly part of it. I did it because the letter was the clearest statement I had of what this house was and what it was supposed to be, and I needed that clarity as an anchor when the pressure of ordinary life in the house made everything else seem negotiable. There is a line in her letter that I have not told you yet because I was saving it for here, for this part of the story where I needed it most. She wrote, "The pressure you will feel will not come from bad people doing obvious things. It will come from people you love doing things they have convinced themselves are reasonable. That is the hardest kind of pressure to resist because it disguises itself as compromise." She'd written that in 2018. She had written it as if she could see 2023 from her study window. Fiona and I had agreed on a course of action that involved 2 stages. The first was the preparation of formal documentation establishing my clear and current intention regarding the property, a document that would be legally registered and that would, if any future claim were made based on informal conversations or implied agreements, provide an unambiguous counter-record. The second was a structured meeting, conducted in Fiona's office and not in my house or theirs, where Lauren and Adrian would be formally informed of the steps I had taken and of the specific legal reality of the situation they had been representing to others. Fiona had used the phrase structured meeting deliberately. She explained what she meant with the particular economy of a lawyer who has had this conversation before. She said that what I needed was not a confrontation. Confrontations are emotional, and emotional situations produce defensive responses that harden positions rather than revealing them. What I needed was a conversation in a professional context with a professional present, in which information was provided rather than accusations made, and in which the formal record of what was said would exist regardless of what anyone later claimed to remember. I asked her whether she thought Lauren would come. She said, "Lauren will come because she will believe she can manage the outcome." She said it without judgment, just the particular flatness of someone describing how a thing works. She was right. I telephoned Adrian on a Tuesday morning and told him I had been meeting with a lawyer about some property documentation and that I thought it would be useful for us all to sit down together, that I had asked Fiona Caldwell to facilitate because I felt better having a professional present for anything that touched on formal documentation. I kept my voice completely even. I said I thought it was an opportunity to clear the air and make sure everyone was on the same page going forward. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I will let Lauren know." He did not ask me what the documentation was. He did not ask why I had been meeting with a lawyer. He said he would let Lauren know, which told me something important about where the decision-making in their household actually resided. Lauren called me back herself 20 minutes later. Her voice was its usual composed, efficient self. She said she thought that was a very sensible approach and that she appreciated my initiative in setting something up. She said she had always believed that formal clarity was better for everyone. She said they would be there. I said, "Good. Thursday at 10, she said, "Thursday at 10. I want to stop here and say something to you before I take you into that Thursday morning, because the section I am about to tell you is one I have replayed in my mind more times than I can count, and each time I replay it I notice something different, something I had not registered consciously in the room, but that was there, in the way that details are there when a moment matters enough to record itself completely. So let me check in with you first. Where are you right now? What city are you in? What part of the world? Put it in the comments because I read everyone and I want to know who is out there in this with me right now. If it is late where you are, if you found this at an hour that you cannot quite explain, I am glad you are here. Leave a like if this story has been sitting somewhere in your chest while you listen. Subscribe for daily stories and let me take you into that Thursday morning, because what happened in Fiona's office is the moment this became something I could live with. I walked to Fiona's office on a Thursday morning in December through the kind of Halifax cold that is perfectly polite about its intentions. No drama in it, just clear and cold and honest. I walked up Hollis Street for the second time with the blue folder under my arm, though this time I was carrying a copy Fiona had made, because the originals were already filed. I arrived at 8:45. Fiona was at her desk when her assistant showed me in, and she looked up and said, "They will be here at 10. "How are you?" I said. "I am all right," she said. "I know. Let me show you what we are going to do." She took me through the structure of the meeting, not in the sense of a script, but in the sense of a sequence. She would begin by thanking them for coming and by establishing the professional nature of the context. She would then present the formal documentation she had prepared regarding my property intention. She would then, calmly and with specific reference to the document she had obtained, describe what she understood to have been communicated to third parties on the subject of this property. She would give them an opportunity to respond. She would not editorialize. She would not characterize anyone's behavior as anything other than what the documents showed it to be. I asked her what she thought would happen when Lauren saw the printed messages. She said, "One of two things. Either she will attempt to explain them in a way that establishes they were misunderstood, or she will recognize that explanation is not available to her in this context, and she will shift her position. Either way, what matters is the formal record of this conversation and the documentation of your intention, which exists regardless of her response." She paused, and then she said, "Malcolm, I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Adrian is going to have a difficult time in that room." I said I understood. She said, "I am not sure you do entirely, because what he may hear for the first time in that room is not just information about this property. He may hear, for the first time with a professional witness present, information about how certain things have been represented on his behalf without his full knowledge. That may be harder for him than for Lauren, not easier." I thought about that. I thought about my son sitting across from me at the kitchen table saying he thought we all needed to be flexible, and I thought about whether he had known exactly what he was asking me to be flexible about, or whether he had simply been relaying a position that had been given to him as if it were his own. I genuinely did not know the answer to that question. I am not sure I know it entirely even now. Adrian and Lauren arrived at 5 minutes to 10. I heard the outer door and heard the assistant's voice, and then I heard Lauren's voice saying, "Thank you," in the particular warm, efficient way she says things in professional contexts. I was sitting in one of the chairs across from Fiona's desk. I did not turn around when they came in. Adrian sat down beside me. He did not look at me directly when he sat. He looked at his hands, which were clasped on his knees, and then he looked at Fiona's desk. He looked like a man who has been told what this meeting is going to be about, but who is still hoping it is going to be something simpler than he expects. Lauren sat down beside Adrian. She was wearing the charcoal gray coat she wears to professional appointments, and she had her bag on her knee, and she looked at Fiona with the expression she uses in administrative contexts, engaged, composed, and with a particular quality of controlled attentiveness that I had watched her deploy for 2.5 years. Fiona said, "Thank you both for coming. I have asked Malcolm to give me a few minutes to explain the purpose of this meeting formally before we open the conversation, and I appreciate your willingness to hear that." Lauren said, "Of course." Fiona then took exactly 12 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on her bookshelf. She presented the formal documentation of my property intention, which she explained had been registered the previous week. She described what this documentation meant in plain legal terms. She explained that any prior informal statements or representations regarding this property that had been communicated to third parties as indicating Malcolm's agreement or support for a transfer were, as a matter of documented fact, not consistent with his stated intention. Then she placed the 3 sheets on the desk, not in front of Lauren, in the center of the desk, equidistant from everyone in the room. She said, "We have obtained copies of several communications in which the Willowmere property was described to third parties as being in a process of transition to family ownership, With Malcolm's support and agreement, I want to give you an opportunity to help us understand those communications." There was a silence. It was not a long silence. It was perhaps 5 seconds, but it was the kind of silence that contains a great deal. Lauren looked at the papers. She looked at them with the particular focus of someone who is reading very quickly and making calculations simultaneously. Her expression did not change, which told me something about how much practice she had at keeping her expression still. Adrian looked at the papers, and then at me, and then at the papers again, and his expression was entirely different. His expression was the expression of a man who has just heard a sound he did not expect in a house he thought he knew, and who is standing very still while he decides whether to move or not. Lauren said, "I think those communications reflect conversations that were ongoing and that may have been expressed with more confidence than the situation warranted at the time." Fiona said, "Can you help me understand what you mean by more confidence than the situation warranted?" Lauren said that discussions about the family's long-term situation had been evolving, and that she may have communicated a sense of direction that was aspirational rather than confirmed. Fiona said, "The communication dated the 14th of August uses the phrase Malcolm's support and blessing. Was that aspirational?" Another silence. Longer this time. Lauren looked at the center of the desk rather than at the papers, and she said, "I may have overstated that." Fiona said, "I appreciate your candor. I want to make sure you both understand that the documentation Malcolm has registered establishes his intent with full legal clarity, and that any prior informal representations that may have been made to third parties are now formally contradicted by that record. Malcolm wanted you to have that clarity directly from him and in a formal context." Adrian had not said anything. He was looking at the table, and I could see from the particular stillness of his face that something was happening behind it that was going to take longer than this room to fully arrive at. Lauren was quiet for a moment, and then she looked at me. Not at Fiona. At me. And she said, "Malcolm, I thought you would never say no to family." I had known something like this was coming. I had thought about it many times. I had thought about what she would say in the moment when the structure she had built ran into the wall of what I had actually decided, and I had tried to prepare for various versions. But hearing it in the room, in her voice, with Adrian beside her and the December light coming through Fiona's window, I understood that what she was telling me was the truth about what she had believed. She had genuinely believed I would not say no, not because she was stupid, because she was right about something. I had been, for a very long time, a man who found it very difficult to say no to the people he loved. She had built a structure on that understanding of me, and the structure had been solid right up until the moment it was not. I said, "That was the part of me you were counting on." It was the only thing I said in that meeting that was not relayed through Fiona. It was a sentence I had not planned. It arrived in my mouth from somewhere that was not strategy but was simply true, and I let it stay in the room without adding anything to it. Fiona moved the meeting forward from there in the way that good lawyers move difficult moments forward, which is by introducing procedural language that gives everyone somewhere to look other than at each other. She described the formal notification that would be prepared. She described the specific steps that would follow. She explained what I was revoking and what I was establishing. She was precise and composed, and entirely without drama. Lauren composed herself quickly. That was the thing that stayed with me most about watching her in that room. She did not cry. She did not argue at length. She regrouped with a speed that was, in its own way, admirable, because it told me that she was a woman who had managed difficult situations before and knew that the moment to fight was not the moment when the documentation was already on the desk. She said she understood. She said she hoped this would not affect the family relationships that mattered to everyone present. She said that more than anything she valued the continuity of the family. I thought of the blue folder. I thought of Margaret's letter. I thought of the word dignity and the word currency and the specific difference between them that my wife had described with such precision in the summer of 2018. I did not say any of that. I simply nodded and said, I valued those relationships too. We left separately. Adrian and Lauren went out first. I stayed in Fiona's office for another 10 minutes, during which she made additional notes, and I drank the rest of my coffee, and we did not say very much because there was not very much that needed to be said. When I stood to leave, she said, "You handled that well." I said, "I had help." She said, "You had preparation and judgment. The help was yours to use." I walked back to Willowmere Crescent along the water. The harbor was gray and flat, and the container ships were where they always were, and the salt smell of the Atlantic was in everything. I put my key in the door of my own house and stepped into the hallway with the listing porch behind me, and the bookshelf in the corridor ahead of me, and the creak of the fourth stair waiting for my foot on the way up, and I stood in the front hall for a moment, just breathing the particular smell of the house, which is old wood and paper and something faintly floral from the soap Margaret always bought, that I still buy because I cannot bring myself to change it. I was still in my own house. My name was still on the door in the way that matters, in every legal and formal and documented sense, and the people who had been treating that fact as a detail to be managed at their convenience now had a formal record explaining that it was not. I put the kettle on. What I want to tell you next is what happened in the days and weeks following, because the meeting in Fiona's office was not an ending. It was a threshold, and the days after a threshold are in some ways more complicated than everything that came before, because the structure that has been holding things in position has been removed, and what you are left with is the actual people. Without the performance, without the management, without the plan, just the actual people having to decide who they are going to be now. Before I get there, I need to stop and breathe here for a moment, because what I just described took something out of me even in the retelling, and I want to acknowledge that. So where are you right now? Seriously, tell me. What city? What part of the country? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments because I want to picture you somewhere specific as I keep going with this. And if you have been sitting with this story and recognizing pieces of it from your own life, from your own family, from your own experience of watching someone treat your love as a resource, leave me a comment and let me know. Just a word or two. I read all of them. Leave a like if this story is earning it, subscribe for daily stories, and let me tell you what happened next with my son, because that is the part that was hardest to sit with, and also, eventually, the part that gave me back something I had thought I might have lost for good. Adrian did not come to the house for 10 days after the meeting. I want to be precise about those 10 days, because they were their own particular chapter, and I do not want to skip them in a way that misrepresents what they actually contained. They were not simply the pause before my son came to apologize. They were the time during which he was doing something I had not anticipated, which was genuinely reckoning with his own position in what had happened. I knew this not because he told me, at least not until later, but because Ethan called me on the 5th day. Not to deliver a message this time. Ethan called me on his own, in his own voice, without anything written in front of him, on a Wednesday afternoon while he was on his lunch break from the environmental assessment project he was working on in Bedford Basin. He said, "Grandpa, I need to tell you something." I said, "I am listening." He said, "I knew when I made that call. I mean, I did not know all of it, but I knew that what I was doing was not right. I knew she had written the words out and that I was reading them like I do not know, like a recording, and I did it anyway because I did not know how not to, and I am sorry. I am really sorry. I want to tell you what it costs a 26-year-old man to say that to his grandfather, because Ethan is not a man who finds confession easy. He has his father's difficulty with it, and his mother's pride, and his own particular blend of both, and the fact that he called me on a Wednesday at lunch from a waterfront assessment site to say I am really sorry without anything else around it was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the kind of thing that tells you who someone is when the circumstances are not kind. I said, "Ethan, I love you. I have never once blamed you for that phone call. You were put in an impossible position and you tried to do what you thought was right within it. That is not something I will ever hold against you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad has been asking to talk to you." I said, "I know. I am going to give him the time he needs." Ethan said, "He is pretty ashamed." I said, "He does not need to be. He needs to be honest. Those are different things, and I am only asking for one of them." What I meant by that was something I had been sitting with for a long time, which is the difference between the shame that makes a man shrink from a situation and the honesty that makes him walk toward it. Adrian's tendency was toward the first. What I was hoping, without knowing whether it was a reasonable hope, was that the specific nature of what had happened in Fiona's office might be enough to shift that tendency in some small direction toward the second. Adrian came on a Saturday morning. Lauren was not with him. He arrived at 9:30, which is not a time he would normally come to my house, and when I opened the door he was wearing his everyday clothes, the dark navy jacket and the gray trousers he wears on weekends, and he looked like a man who has not been sleeping well, which I knew, because I recognized that particular quality of tiredness in a face I have known for 34 years. I let him in. I did not say anything that required him to begin in the hallway. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and he followed me and sat down at the kitchen table in the chair that has been his chair since he was old enough to sit at a table, which is the chair on the south side closest to the window, and he put both hands flat on the table in front of him. I put 2 mugs of tea down and sat across from him and waited. He said, "Dad, I have been trying to figure out what to say to you for 10 days, and I still do not really know." I said, "Then say what you know, and we will work with that." He looked at the tea. He said, "I knew it was not right. What Lauren was doing, what she was telling people, the way she was talking about the house. I knew it was not right. And I told myself that I was not really part of it, that I was just, I do not know, adjacent to it, that if I did not ask specific questions about what she was saying, to who then, I was not really responsible for any of it. I let myself believe that." He stopped. Then he said, "That is not how responsibility works." I said, "No, it is not." He said, "I also, the money stuff, the investments, losing what we lost. I am still ashamed of that. I think I let the shame of that make me need Lauren to be right about everything else, because if she was right about the practical things, then maybe the investment stuff was just a mistake and not something bigger. I do not know if that makes sense." I said it made sense. He said, "It does not excuse anything." I said, "No, but understanding it is not the same as excusing it, and understanding it is worth something." We sat with that for a while. The tea cooled. The rain was not raining for once, which in Halifax in December is its own kind of event, and the gray winter light was coming through the kitchen window the way it does in the short afternoons of that time of year, thin and honest and without warmth but not unkind. I said, "Adrian, I want to tell you something that is not an accusation but is important for you to hear." He said, "Okay." I said, "Your mother wrote me a letter. Before she died. I found it in October in a folder in the office. She wrote it in 2018. She wrote to me about this house and about what I should protect it from, and about the specific way my love for my family could be used as a weakness." Adrian was very still. I said, "She did not write it about Lauren. She could not have known the specifics. She wrote it because she knew me. She knew the particular place where I was most likely to give away what I should have held on to. And she left me a letter there, so that I would not be standing in that place alone when the moment came." Adrian's face did something I had not seen it do since he was much younger, since the night Margaret died and he stood in the hospital corridor and did not know where to put his hands. It tightened and then released in the way of a man who is not going to cry, but who is very close to the place where crying lives. He said, "She knew you that well." I said, "She knew me that well." He put his hands around his mug and said quietly that he was sorry. Not in the way people say sorry when they are ending a conversation, in the way they say it when they mean it, the way a man means very few things in his life, which is with the full weight of understanding what they have done and what it cost and what it cannot be taken back. I said, "I know." We sat in that kitchen for another hour and a half. We talked about things that had nothing to do with the house, and then about things that had everything to do with it, and then about Margaret. which was the thing underneath all of it, the absence that had made the whole situation possible, the loss that had created the space that everything else had moved into. I told him about reading the letter on the closet floor. He told me he still could not go into her study without feeling it like pressure in his chest. We talked about her the way you talk about someone when enough time has passed, that grief has become something you can handle without it handling you, but only barely. When he left, he stood at the front door for a moment and said, "What happens with the house now?" I said, "It stays in my name." That was always what was right. He nodded. He said, "What happens with Lauren?" I said, "That is not my question to answer. That is yours." He nodded again. He walked down the front porch steps, the ones that list slightly to the left, and I watched him go, and I did not know what the next chapter of his life was going to look like, and I was honest enough with myself to admit that I did not know whether the version of his marriage that had brought him to my door that morning could sustain what had been revealed in the room. But I knew that he had come, and I knew what coming had cost him, and that was something. The weeks that followed the meeting in Fiona's office and the Saturday morning with Adrian were not dramatic. I want to be clear about this because it would be dishonest to tell you that justice arrived the way it arrives in stories, with a clean line drawn and everything settled on the right side of it. What actually happened was more like the gradual redistribution of weight in a structure after something has been removed from a load-bearing position. Things shifted. Some of them settled into better configurations. Some of them exposed damage that had been hidden behind the weight. Lauren and Adrian did not separate immediately. I want to tell you that honestly because the story would be simpler if they had, and simpler stories are not always the ones that are true. What happened instead was that the two of them had a period of months during which their household was, from what I understood through Ethan, significantly different from what it had been. Quieter, more careful. The particular quality of a space where something has been said out loud that cannot be unsaid, and where the people inside it are deciding what to do with it. I did not hear from Lauren directly for 8 weeks after the meeting. When she did contact me, it was by letter, not telephone, which surprised me. It was a brief letter, handwritten on the clinic's personal stationery, and it said the kinds of things that people say in letters they have rewritten many times before sending. It said she understood that she had overstepped. It said she had not intended to act against my wishes. It said she recognized that the way she had spoken to others about the property had not been fair to me. It ended by saying she hoped that the family could find a way forward together. I read it twice. I put it in the desk drawer in the office. I did not throw it away, but I also did not respond to it immediately, because the things it did not say were as present as the things it did, and I needed to sit with both for a while before I knew what I wanted to say in return. The thing the letter did not say was why. Not why she had spoken to people about the property, as if my agreement were already given. Not why she had used Ethan as a messenger for a conditional demand. Not why the word family had meant something different in her usage than it meant in mine. The letter addressed the practical surface of what had happened without touching the thing underneath it, the particular logic she had been operating from, and until I understood that logic at least somewhat, I could not respond in a way that would be honest. I want to stop here and tell you about something that happened in mid-January that I have not mentioned yet, because it is the part of this story that changed the shape of my understanding the most completely, and it did not happen in a lawyer's office or at a kitchen table. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon at a small cafe on Blower Street, over coffee I had not expected to be drinking. I need to take a breath here before I tell you about it. Where are you watching from right now? What is your city? Your part of the world? Drop it in the comments, and if you have been with me through this whole story, if you found this at some point today or tonight and you stayed, I want you to know that means something real to me. Leave a like, subscribe for daily stories, something new here every single day. And let me tell you about the Wednesday afternoon that gave me the last piece of what I needed to understand. Fiona called me on a Tuesday evening and said she had received a call from an individual who had asked to speak with Malcolm Whitaker informally and without any formal legal context. The individual had said she was a colleague of Lauren's from the clinic on Spring Garden Road. She had said she had information she felt I should have, that she had been carrying it for several months, and that after the meeting she had heard about, through the particular channels by which professional communities in a city the size of Halifax communicate such things without quite meaning to, she had decided she needed to say it to someone. Her name was Catherine. She was in her late 40s, with the particular composed manner of someone who has worked in healthcare administration long enough to have learned to deliver difficult information without dramatizing it. She was waiting at a corner table when I arrived, and she had already ordered coffee, and she thanked me for coming in a way that told me she had thought about whether to do this for a long time before she did. She said, "I want to be clear that I am here because I think it is the right thing to do, not because I have any personal difficulty with Lauren as a professional. She is very good at her job. What she told me about your family situation is not something she told me in confidence. She told several of us at various points, and she told us in a way that was designed to create a certain understanding of you in our minds before any of us had ever met you." I said, "What understanding was that?" She said, "That you were a man who was managing a difficult grief process and who had told your family, informally but clearly, that you wanted the house to stay within the family and that you were uncertain about formal legal steps because of the emotional weight of the property. She presented your hesitation about formal documentation as your way of protecting yourself emotionally while still intending to transfer the property. She said you had told Adrian as much." I sat with that for a moment. The coffee was good, the kind of plain dark roast that Halifax cafes do without pretension, and the street outside was doing the ordinary business of a January Wednesday, people in coats moving from one warm place to another. I said, "I never told Adrian that." She said, "I know that now. What I want you to know is that the narrative she constructed was very coherent. She is a very organized person, and she had thought through every likely question and had an answer for it that sounded reasonable. If you had heard it without knowing you would probably have believed it." I asked her what had changed. What had made her decide to contact me? She said, "She asked me to witness a document last September. She said it was a family financial planning document. She did not show me the full document. She showed me only the signature line she was asking me to witness and said it was a formality. I signed. Then, 3 weeks later, she asked me to sign a second page from the same document that she said had been prepared separately. It had a date on it that was different from the first page. She looked at her coffee. She said, "I am a healthcare administrator. I have been dealing with documents for 20 years. When a 2-page document has 2 different dates and I am asked to sign them separately and told it is a formality, I understand what that means, and I understood that I had already signed something I probably should not have signed without reading it in full. I was not willing to sign the second page." She said, "I also went back and read what I had signed on the first page more carefully. It described me as a witness to a verbal agreement regarding a family property matter. I had not witnessed any verbal agreement. I had not been present for any conversation between Lauren and anyone else about any property. She had asked me to sign a document stating I had witnessed something I had never witnessed. I sat in that cafe on Blower Street, and I understood that the blue folder in my office, the letter from Margaret, the meeting in Fiona's office, the formal documentation that had been registered, all of it had been necessary, but none of it had been the complete picture. The complete picture included this woman across from me, who had spent several months deciding whether to say something, who had finally decided that staying silent meant being party to something she could not be party to. I thanked her. I told her that what she had said was important, and that I wanted to be honest with her about what I was going to do with it. I told her I was going to share it with my lawyer and that Fiona might need to contact her formally about what she had witnessed. She said she understood and that she was prepared for that. She said she was sorry she had signed the first page. I said she could not have known what she was signing, and she said she should have read it more carefully, which was true, and which she clearly had already made peace with in her own way. I walked home from Blower Street through the January cold, which is the most genuinely cold that Halifax gets, and I walked past the public gardens and up South Park Street and along the familiar route to Willowmere, and I thought about the specific word that Catherine had used, without quite meaning to, the word coherent. She had said the narrative Lauren constructed was very coherent. And it was. That was the most honest thing anyone had said about what Lauren had done, which was not reckless or impulsive or driven by anything obviously destructive. It was a plan. A coherent, patient, carefully maintained plan. And the thing that had undone it was not drama or accusation or confrontation. It was documentation and the willingness of one woman who had been asked to sign something she had not witnessed to eventually say that out loud. I shared what Catherine had told me with Fiona that Friday. Fiona listened without interrupting, which is her way, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "This changes the nature of what we have documented. What you described is an attempt to create false witness records for an agreement that did not exist. That is not simply a matter of representing informal conversations in a way that overstated their direction. That is a different category of thing." I asked her what that meant in practical terms. She said, "It means that if you choose to pursue this formally, the record you now have is substantially stronger than what we filed in November. It also means, and I want you to be clear about this, that you have a choice about whether to pursue it formally. The property is protected. Your documentation is filed. The informal representations Lauren made to third parties have been formally contradicted. What Catherine has described adds to the record, but does not change your current situation. What it changes is the question of what consequence, if any, you want this to have for Lauren formally." I said, "What do you recommend?" She said, "I think that depends on what you want this to have done when it is over. And I do not mean that in terms of what you want done to Lauren. I mean what you want the situation to have accomplished for you and for the people in your family. Those are different questions." I sat with that for a long time after I left her office. I want to tell you what I sat with, because this is the part of the story that I think matters most, and it is the part that is hardest to say without it sounding like something I have polished into a lesson it did not feel like at the time. What I sat with was the question of what I was actually fighting for. I had been fighting to keep the house. That was true, and I had won that. The house was mine, and was going to remain mine, and the documentation existed to ensure that no informal conversation or aspirational communication or false witness record could change that. But the house had never really been just about the house. I knew that. Margaret's letter had said it plainly. The house was the place where my life was legible to me. The place where 31 years of a marriage that had been the central fact of my existence was still present in the details, in the creak and the bench, and the particular morning light and the smell of the soap that I still bought, because it was the right soap for that house, and no other reason. I had been fighting to keep that legibility, to keep the right to go on reading my own life in the space where it had been lived. What I had also been fighting for, without fully naming it until I was walking home from Fiona's office in the January cold, was something harder to articulate. I had been fighting for the right to be the person I actually was, rather than the person someone else had decided it was convenient for me to be. Lauren had built a plan around a version of me, a version that was lonely and grieving and generous to a fault and unable to say no to family, and that version was real. I was that person in certain moments and in certain configurations of circumstance, but I was not only that person. I was also someone who had spent 35 years reading documents in an industry that punished imprecision. Someone whose wife had known him well enough to write him a specific letter for a specific kind of moment. Someone who had a lawyer who answered at 8:30 and made coffee without asking. Someone who had a grandson who called on a Wednesday from Bedford Basin and said, "I am really sorry," with nothing else around it. I was that person too. And the plan Lauren had built had not accounted for that person at all. I decided not to pursue the witness document issue formally. I want to be honest about why, because the honest reason is less noble than it might sound. It was not forgiveness, at least not entirely. It was not mercy. It was something more practical, which is that I understood what a formal legal process involving Lauren would cost the people around her who had not chosen to be inside this situation. It would cost Adrian. It would cost Ethan. It would put them through something that I was not sure the thing I would gain at the end of it was worth to any of us. I had what I needed. The house was protected. The documentation existed. Catherine's account was in Fiona's file, noted and formal, available if it was ever necessary, but not deployed where it was not. And Lauren now knew, with the particular certainty of a very organized person who understands documentation, that the record existed, and that any future attempt to represent my position as something other than what it was would be contradicted by that record. That was enough. Not in the sense of it being all I wanted, in the sense of it being what I could live with doing. Fiona, when I told her my decision, said simply, "All right." She made a note. She said, "I think that is a sound judgment." She said it the way she said things, without flattery to either the decision or the person making it. Just the flat professional acknowledgement of something that had been considered carefully and arrived at honestly. I walked home for the last time along that particular route, and I thought about what I was going to do with the house now that it was fully and unambiguously mine. The idea had been forming for a while, since October probably, since the closet floor and the letter. I had been thinking about what Margaret would have wanted the house to mean, not just to me while I was alive, but beyond that, in the longer sense of what a life accumulates and what it should be used for when the accumulation is complete. I called Thomas Barclay's widow and asked if she knew the name of the solicitor Thomas had recommended for estate planning, and she gave me a name, and I made an appointment. I also called Fiona, not for legal advice this time, but because I wanted to tell her what I was thinking before I committed to it, and she listened and said it sounded like exactly the right thing, and that she was glad I had called. What I was planning was this: the house would remain in my name for as long as I lived in it. After that, rather than passing it within the family in a way that would simply recreate the contest that had nearly cost me everything, it would be sold. The proceeds from the sale would be used to establish a small endowment, administered through a foundation connected to Dalhousie University, that would fund grants for adults over the age of 25 in Halifax who were rebuilding their professional lives after a significant interruption. The interruption could be illness, financial difficulty, family circumstances, any of the things that knock people off the path of their own plans without their consent. The endowment would be in Margaret's name. I had never intended the house to be a prize. I had never intended it to be a currency or a gesture of trust or a demonstration of commitment to one person's idea of what the family should look like. I had intended it to be what it had always been, a place where people I loved could be present to each other in the ordinary ways that matter, without owing each other anything for the privilege. When that was no longer possible in the form I had intended, the thing to do was to let it become something else that was still true to what Margaret had meant by it. A place of dignity, a foundation, something that held rather than something that was held. I told Ethan about the plan when he came for Thursday dinner in February. He sat across from me at the kitchen table in his usual chair, and I told him about the endowment and about Margaret's name on it, and he was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "She would have liked that." I said, "I think so." He said, "What happens to the house in the meantime?" I said, "I live in it, the way I always have." He said, "Can I still come on Thursdays?" I said, "Ethan, you can come on Thursdays until one of us is unable to manage the stairs." He smiled. It was a small smile, the particular smile of a young man who is relieved in a way he is not going to make large, and I recognized it because it is the smile his father has, and his father's smile is something that has been in my field of vision for 34 years. I want to say something to you, directly now. Before I finish telling you what happened on the last evening of this story, I want to speak to you not as a narrator, but as a man who has been through something and came out the other side of it, still holding his own name. Where are you? I've asked you this several times, and I am asking once more for the last time. What city? What province? What part of the world? Tell me in the comments. And if you are someone who has been carrying something like what I carried, if you have been in the position of watching your love for your family be treated as a resource to be managed, if you have been the person in the room who knew and could not yet say, if you have been the old man or the old woman that someone was counting on not to push back, I want to say something to you that is not advice and is not strategy. If you are a young person who has been put in the middle of something between family members who are in conflict, who has been used as a messenger or a witness or a bridge in a situation that was not yours to carry, I want to say to you what I said to Ethan and what I mean with complete sincerity. The love that matters does not come with conditions. A person who asks you to carry a message designed to extract something from someone else is not asking you to do a family duty. They are asking you to participate in a transaction while they remain at a distance from its consequences. You are allowed to put that down. You are allowed to say, as Ethan eventually said in the only honest sentence of that November phone call, "I love you, and I will not make you carry her message." Those words, spoken in that order, are the complete expression of everything this story has been about. I want to pause here, because I realize I have been speaking for a long time, and I want you to stay with me for a few more minutes, because what I am about to tell you is the last thing and the most important thing. Where are you right now? I want to know. What city, what province, what part of the world? Tell me in the comments. And if you have been here from the beginning, if you found this story at whatever hour, and you stayed through every part of it, I want you to know that this old man felt you there. Not metaphorically, in the particular way that a person who is saying something that matters feels the presence of the people receiving it. I felt you there. Leave a like if this story gave you something. Subscribe for daily stories, something new here every single day on this channel. Share this with someone who needs it, not as a lecture and not as a subtle point, but as a door, the same way I am telling it to you. And then stay for the last part, because it is the part I have been working towards since I first picked up the telephone on that rainy November evening and heard my grandson's voice reading words that were not his. The last evening I want to tell you about is not dramatic. It will not feel like a conclusion in the cinematic sense, because real conclusions rarely do. It happened on a Thursday in June, which is when Halifax finally arrives at the summer it has been considering since February, and the light in the evening lasts so long that by 8:30 the sky is still pale and gold, and the harbor is doing that particular thing it does in summer, where it holds the light on its surface after the sky has started to give it up. Ethan had been for dinner, as he is most Thursdays. Sarah had come with him, as she has been coming most Thursdays since May. We had eaten at the kitchen table and talked about the Bedford Basin project, which was producing some findings that Ethan was genuinely excited about in the particular contained way he expresses genuine excitement, and about a book Sarah was reading about the history of the Halifax harbor explosion of 1917, which is one of those chapters in the city's history that repays reading every time you come back to it. I had asked her questions about it, and she had answered them with the kind of detail that told me she was not reading it for conversation material, but because she was actually interested. I had told her some things about the explosion that she had not found in the book yet, because I have been reading about Halifax long enough to have gathered things from sources that take a while to find, and she had written them down in the small notebook she carries, which I noticed and approved of in the way one approves of a habit that indicates a particular kind of mind. They left at 9. I washed the dishes and dried them and put them in their places and turned off the kitchen light and left the small lamp above the stove burning, which is what I always do. Then I went to the corridor, to the bookshelf with Margaret's paperbacks with their broken spines. I looked at the blue folder on the shelf, between the essay collection and the unfinished novel, and I looked at Ethan's letter beside it. And I looked at the photograph of Margaret that I have placed on the shelf nearest the window, because that is where the morning light reaches it first. She was laughing in the photograph at something I said that I still cannot remember. The bench she found in Mahone Bay was behind her, and the summer light of 2016 had caught her hair in that particular way, and she was entirely herself in it, entirely present and entirely unaware of the particular value of what she was, which is the quality of people who do not need to understand their own worth in order to embody it completely. I stood in the corridor for a while. Then I went to the front porch, the one that lists to the left. I turned on the light, the small, warm overhead light that makes the porch visible from Willowmere Crescent. The maple trees were in their full June green, and the evening light was still present in the pale gold way of Halifax in summer, and the harbor smell was in the warm air, lighter than its winter self. more open. The particular smell of the Atlantic when it is not trying to remind you of its power, but is simply present in the background of everything, the way the things that matter most in a life are present, not demanding attention, but impossible to be unaware of. I stood on the porch and I thought about a house, about what it is and what it holds, and what it cannot hold, and what it is asked to hold that it was never built for. A house holds the physical facts of a life. The creak on the fourth stair, the soap smell, the morning light angle, the bench visible through the kitchen window. These things are real, and they are not nothing. They are, in fact, the medium in which memory lives when the person who made the memories is no longer there to carry them. A house holds those things, and I do not understate what it means to keep them. But a house cannot hold a man's name for him. That is something he has to hold himself. Not aggressively and not defensively, but simply, the way you hold anything you have earned and intend to keep, with the particular quiet confidence of knowing what it is, and what it is worth and what it is not available to be. I had held my name through the past year and a half. I had held it when it would have been easier to put it down. I had held it not because I am a man without doubt or without fear, or without the particular longing for connection that had made me vulnerable to begin with. I had held it because my wife had written me a letter that said, "Hold it," and because I loved her enough to do what she asked, and because the house I was standing on the porch of was the place where that love still lived in every detail I had refused to change. That night I understood something that I want to say to you plainly, without dressing it in anything more than it is. The things that last in a life are not the things that are legally documented, though documentation matters, and Fiona's files exist for good reason. The things that last are the things that are freely given and freely held. The love that asks nothing in exchange for itself. The letter written in 2018 for a moment that would come in 2023. The lawyer who answers at 8:30. The grandson who calls from Bedford Basin. The colleague who would not sign something she had not witnessed. The son who stands at a bandstand in March and says the true thing. The young woman who writes down in a small notebook the things she does not know yet. These are the things that last, not because they are dramatic or legally significant, but because they are true, and truth in the end is the only thing that does not require any of the rest of us to maintain it. It just is what it is. And eventually, in every situation I have ever encountered in 58 years of paying attention, truth is what is left when everything else has run out of room. I turned the porch light off, then I turned it back on, not as an invitation, not as a performance, as the particular choice of a man who has been through something real and has come out the other side of it, still knowing who he is, still choosing to keep the light on, because that is who he is. Because nothing that happened changed that. Because the house can hold the memories, but the man has to hold his own name. And the man whose name is Malcolm Whitaker, 58 years old, widower, father, grandfather, resident of 17 Willowmere Crescent in the south end of Halifax, Nova Scotia, is still here. Still here. I have one last thing to ask of you. Leave me a comment with a single word. The word is foundation. If you were truly here through all of it, from the telephone in November to the porch light in June, from the closet floor to the bandstand to the Blower Street Cafe to the Margaret Whitaker Foundation for Adult Renewal, you know exactly why I chose that word. It is what the house was. It is what Margaret's letter was. It is what the love of the people who showed up actually is. It is what you build when you refuse to let what you have built be taken from you, not by force, but by simply, quietly, thoroughly remaining yourself. Leave that word in the comments. Foundation. And tell me your city, your province, your part of the world, because I want to know who was in this with me tonight. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There is a new story here every single day. Some of them are like this one, and some of them are different, and all of them are told by people who have something true to say, and are saying it out loud for the first time. Leave a like if this story earned it. Share it with someone who needs it. Someone who is carrying what Malcolm was carrying. Someone who is being counted on not to push back. someone who needs to know that the years they have lived are not a weakness, but the precise and irreplaceable thing that will eventually make them impossible to manage. From wherever I am sitting, in this house that is mine in every sense that matters, to wherever you are sitting right now, I want to say this simply and without any decoration around it. Take care of each other. Take care of the people you love enough to fight for. Take care of your own name. And take care of the truth, wherever you find it, because the truth does not require maintenance. But it does require someone willing to stand in it. Good night, and thank you for being here.